Hello and welcome to the Daily Aus. I'm Billi FitzSimons.
I'm Zara Seidler.
Well, we are now less than a week out from the election when more than 18 million Australians are due to vote for who will form the country's next government and who will be the next Prime Minister. On today's episode, we're going to break down who the major parties in Australia are. Now, all your life, you've probably been hearing about the Labor Party and the Coalition, but if you've never stopped to do a deep dive on either of those parties, then this podcast is for you.
Billi, I always like the opportunity to just step back and explain the basics that really sits behind our political system. It's something that we take for granted, this idea that we all know everything, but it is really important to explain the basics. So, Billi, how does our Australian political system work? Just a small question to start with.
Okay, so Australia's political landscape is often described as a two-party system, and that's because we do have two major parties or two major groups who tend to get the majority of votes and who tend to make up most of the spots in Parliament. And that's the Labor Party and the Coalition. Now, for several decades, it's been either the Labor Party or the Coalition who have been in government with the other in opposition. So there's always one party that's in government and one party who's in opposition, and their job in opposition is kind of to hold the government of the day to account. Now, Labor is one single party, but unlike Labor, the Coalition isn't actually a single party. It's two, or actually it's more than two, but mainly it's two.
Let's not get bogged down in the specificity here, but yes, it is a coalition of multiple players here.
Yes.
And so let's start with the Coalition. How do they bill themselves? What are they about?
So the Coalition is a formal alliance between the Liberal Party and the National Party. And then, like I kind of just said, there are a few other very small parties, but they kind of do fall under
subsidiaries of the Liberal and Nationals.
Exactly. And so they join forces to govern together if they win enough seats collectively in the House of Representatives. Now, since 2022, the Coalition has been in opposition. But before that, they were actually in government for nearly a decade. You might remember some of the prime ministers of that time. We had Tony Abbott, we had Malcolm Turnbull, and then we had Scott Morrison, which I'm sure many of our listeners, our younger listeners, they will remember maybe Scott Morrison more than the previous two. And then right before that, if we're going back to, the early 2000s, we had John Howard. So those are some of the famous Coalition prime ministers.
Yep.
And important to say that when the Coalition is in government, it's the leader of the Liberal Party who becomes the Prime Minister, and then it's the leader of the National Party who becomes the Deputy Prime Minister. Now, Deputy Prime Ministers definitely don't have the same high profile as Prime Ministers, but one Deputy Prime Minister that you might be familiar with was Barnaby Joyce. He definitely had maybe a higher profile than some of the previous ones.
Definitely. Okay, so this coalition is made up of the Liberal Party and of the Nationals. Starting first with the Liberal Party, what do they stand for?
Yeah, so the Liberal Party is usually considered to be on the right side of the political spectrum.
I want to stop you there because you and I often do panels where we explain the basics of politics, and this idea of the left and the right can be quite an abstract term for a lot of people. What do you mean by the right?
I vividly remember in year 10, my history teacher throwing out the schedule for that day and saying, today I'm teaching you the difference between the left and the right in politics.
Sounds amazing.
It was amazing. And to this
I
day,
taught that.
It's the only class I remember. No, but it's it was just the most amazing lesson. So for anyone who didn't have Mr. Muir as a year 10 history teacher, you're right that it's something that we always hear about but is never quite explained to us. So it's a common way to define political parties as existing on this kind of spectrum between the left and the right. And the left is considered to be more socially progressive, and it tends to favour the government playing a more active role in our lives. And then the right is the opposite. So they favour the government playing less of a role in our lives and kind
small
of
government.
Exactly. And that is what the Liberal Party is usually considered to be. It's considered to be more right of centre, although important to note that especially in Australia, both of the major parties are quite centre,
Yeah.
but then Liberal Party a little bit more to the right and Labor Party a little bit more to the left.
Yeah.
Back to the Liberal Party though. So they position themselves as the party of business, and they tend to push for economic changes that benefit businesses and their owners. And like I just said, they tend to believe that the government should have minimal interference in our daily lives, prioritising kind of individual freedom and responsibility. And it also tends to be more socially conservative than Labor.
Okay, so when we talk about the Liberal Party, an easy way to think about it is small government, like market running itself,
Yes.
and tends to be a bit more socially conservative than what we see from the Labor Party.
And when you say market, economic market.
Yeah, correct. So then that's the Liberal Party. They're in coalition with the Nationals. Tell me about the Nationals.
So the National Party is traditionally the party for regional Australia. I'm pretty sure all of their seats that they hold in the House of Representatives are in regional or rural parts of Australia. And that's because it has a particular focus on agricultural and mining industries. And if we go back to that spectrum that we were just talking about, they tend to be considered further to the right than the Liberal Party, especially on social issues and also on environmental issues.
And so it's that very interesting balance that the coalition has to get right, which is that the Nationals do tend to sit differently on the spectrum to certainly some parts of the Liberal Party, but because they govern together, they have to reach this compromise and they have to have a party position as the coalition. So what are some of the key policies that the coalition has put forward with this federal election coming up?
Okay, I would say that there are two big things that they are focusing on. The first is cost of living, and I'd say they're kind of focusing on that through two main ways. The first is through their fuel excise. So you might not know that every single time you fill up your car or fill up your motorbike, you are paying 50 cents per litre in tax on the price of petrol. Now, what the coalition wants to do if they get into government is halve that to be 25 cents. So in effect, that would mean that your petrol is 25 cents cheaper per litre that you fill up. So that's the first way that they're trying to address cost of living. And then the second way is through housing. They talk a lot about trying to help first home buyers get into the market. And they have a range of different policies to do that. I think a key one is that they want to help first home buyers access up to $50,000 of their superannuation to help them buy a home. And then if you did that, so if you access $50,000 of your superannuation, you would then need to put that money back if you were then to sell the house that you bought with that money. Does that make sense?
Yeah, makes sense. And so that's their kind of central housing proposition, or at least a way to get new home buyers into the market. But then, Billi, another key policy pillar, I'd call it, is really energy. And I don't think that this is unique to the coalition. Both Labor and the coalition are really focusing on cost of living and energy as these two big topics, but the way that they're doing it is very different. Talk me through the coalition's energy policy.
Hi there, my name's Emma. I'm the editor at the Daily Aus, just popping in to say hi and let you know that here at the Daily Aus, we are an independent media company who work to break down the news for young Aussies in a digestible and accessible way. If you like what you're watching and you like what we do, please hit the subscribe button. Now back to the video.
Yes, this is a big one, so stick with me.
Yeah.
So basically with energy, Australia over the next decade or so is going through a period of transition.
Yeah.
And what the coalition wants to do is they want to introduce nuclear energy into Australia. So they want to build nuclear reactors on the sites of coal-fired power stations, which are stations that are already closing down in the next decade or so. Now, just to explain that a bit more, because I did have to go do a lot of research.
Had a lot of to and fro on this one.
Yes, because I really wanted to understand, first, why is it that they are saying that they think we need this? So like I just said, all coal-fired power stations are due to close in Australia in the next decade or so. That's due to multiple reasons, like their impact on the environment and then also just the growing popularity of renewable energy sources. And so with the closure of these coal-fired power stations, there becomes a gap in the market that needs to be filled. And just to give you an idea of that gap, In 2023, 46% of electricity generation in Australia came from coal. So that's about half, and that now needs to be filled. So the coalition says Australia is running out of energy, which will mean inconsistent energy sources, so more blackouts, and also higher energy bills. But they say that they can solve that through nuclear energy, which they say is the cheaper, cleaner, and more consistent alternative. And so they want to build these nuclear reactors on these retired coal-fired power stations to keep Australia's energy source running smoothly. So that's their aim. And this is their alternative to Labor's plan, which is to focus on renewable energy, so mostly solar and wind power.
I mean, it's certainly the quickest explanation I've ever heard on nuclear. I do just want to add, though, the reason listeners might not be familiar with nuclear power, I guess the reason you and I have had to spend so long trying to get our heads around it is it's been banned in Australia since the 90s. The coalition under John Howard at that point banned nuclear in Australia. That was as a result of shifting public opinion. We all know of many nuclear-related disasters. And so what the coalition is saying here is that they are going to repeal that ban and use, as you said, those coal-fired stations or the retired ones to set up nuclear reactors. And throughout this campaign, there's been a real to and fro between the coalition and Labor on how much that will cost. But again, a whole nother podcast, so we will leave that there. But we will absolutely be uploading pieces to TDA that really explains where the coalition is going with their thinking here.
I was just going to say that throughout this podcast, also when we go through Labor's policies, I'm kind of just telling you their perspective on why they think those policies are important.
Yeah.
Obviously, there's a lot of criticism on both sides about the different policies, and I'm not really going through that. I thought it was important to just tell you what are the policies from their perspective.
Yeah, and then it's for our listeners to look at what is being suggested on both sides and decide what they think is better for them.
Yes.
All right. So on that topic, we obviously have another party, the party that is in government currently, Labor. Tell me about Labor.
So the Labor Party traditionally positions itself as the party of working people. So we said before the Liberal Party was more the party of business. The Labor Party is much more the party of working people. It has its roots in the union movement, and they say they exist to push for economic changes that benefit workers specifically, such as things like increasing the minimum wage. And just to go back to the spectrum we were talking about before, we keep going back to it, they exist more on the left of the spectrum. But again, just like the Liberal Party, they are close to the centre as well. Now, their current leader is Anthony Albanese, who is, of course, the current Prime Minister. And then some recent Prime Ministers from the Labor Party that listeners might be familiar with include Kevin Rudd, Kevin 07, probably one of the most successful political campaigns in recent memory. And then there was also Julia Gillard, who was our first female Prime Minister in Australia and only. And then Kevin Rudd again. We went back to Kevin Rudd.
Yeah, it was an interesting time in politics, wasn't it?
Yes.
So what are the key policies that Labor is taking to this election?
Yeah, so similar to the coalition, they are also campaigning very heavily on helping voters with the cost of living and the housing crisis. But the ways in which they propose to do that are a little bit different. So first, with housing, they also have a range of policies to help first home buyers specifically. One way that they are proposing to do this is to allow all first home buyers the ability to buy a home with just a 5% deposit. So usually the minimum you would need is 10%, and they're saying that they would bring that down to 5%. And they say that they'll do that by guaranteeing a portion of a first home buyer's loan and not requiring the first home buyer to pay lender's mortgage insurance. Are you familiar with lender's mortgage insurance?
Honestly, it's really niche, but I am, because I did a lot of work on it in my previous job.
Oh.
I know. Super
I didn't
weird.
know that about you.
Yeah, I know.
For anyone who's not familiar with it, it's basically just a fee that you need to pay if the deposit you're putting down is below a certain percentage of a property price. I think it's usually 20%. So what Labor is saying is that if you're a first home buyer, you wouldn't have to pay that under their policy. And then I talked about energy before. So Labor's proposal in this area is to get our energy grid to 82% renewables by 2030. Now, just to give you an idea, in 2023, 35% of Australia's total electricity generation was from renewable energy sources. And so they want to increase that 35% in 2023 to 82% by 2030. So basically doubling it in less than a decade. And so just to recap that again, the coalition, they are wanting to rely on nuclear energy to fix this gap, and then Labor is wanting to rely on renewables.
Billi, very helpful to understand what the value or the offering from both of the major parties this election is, but always important to note that when you go to the ballot box, it's not just the major parties that are on that ballot. We will be speaking in a later episode this week about minor parties, about independents, because although we do exist in this kind of two-party system, we are seeing the growing prominence of those minor parties and of those independents, and we will absolutely be talking about them ahead of the election. But for today, thank you for taking us through Labor and the coalition, and thank you for joining us for another episode of The Daily Aus. This week, we'll be taking you through Politics 101. It's more important than ever that you have unbiased and factual political information, and you can count on The Daily Aus to get you there. We'll be back later today with the headlines, but until then, have a great day.